So, how deep into the past do you think you have to go to justify a modern conflict?
Oh, wow. I mean, usually what, like 10 years? Maybe 100?
Right, exactly.
Right.
Usually you point to, a treaty from the last century or maybe a border drawn up after a recent war.
Yeah, that's the standard political playbook.
But what if you are handed this metaphorical title deed to an entire nation, and the justification on that deed goes back over 1,000 years? Like, straight down to the foundational myth of a country.
That is a whole different level of historical weaponization.
It really is. And welcome to the deep dive, by the way. Today, for you listening, we are exploring an incredibly intense, highly detailed historical battle. We're looking at the origins of Kyivan Rus.
Yes, and we're looking at primary evidence that, well, it completely upends the narrative that's currently being used to justify the invasion of Ukraine.
Exactly. And just to be totally clear right up front, our mission today is to impartially separate the historical claims from the political propaganda. We're not endorsing the hostility in the source material, but we are going to analyze the arguments and the evidence they bring to the table.
Right, because the focal point of this entire historical dispute, it really rests on the shoulders of one single figure, and that is Rurik.
Rurik, the
Yeah.
legendary Viking founder.
Right, because in the official Russian state narrative, the year 862 is basically the anchor point. I mean, if you read the 2021 essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, or watch that 2024 Tucker Carlson interview.
Oh, yeah, that interview.
Yeah, that year, 862, is the definitive starting line. The claim is that the Slavic tribes in the north invited this Viking warrior Rurik to come and rule over them in the city of Novgorod.
Right.
And that specific moment is presented as the birth of the Russian state. It's supposed to cement this unbroken lineage from Novgorod straight down to modern-day Moscow.
It's like the ultimate untouchable origin story. This heroic founder arrives from the wild to bring order to chaos. But when historians actually start digging into the contemporary chronicles and the physical evidence, they find a guy who completely contradicts that story.
They really do.
Okay.
Because we actually know who Rurik was. And he wasn't some wandering warlord who just stumbled out of the eastern forests.
No, he had a real name and a real resume. He was a man named Rurik of Dorestad.
Exactly. Rurik of Dorestad. He was a Danish prince, specifically of the Rugen line. But the really important part is that he was a deeply entrenched player in Western European politics.
No, he was not an unknown entity.
Not at all. By the time he supposedly went east in 862, he was already a vassal to the Frankish emperors. I mean, he controlled Dorestad, which was located in Frisia.
Which is basically the modern-day Netherlands, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, think about the logistics of that for a second. Dorestad was situated near the mouths of the Rhine, the Maas, and the Scheldt rivers. So Rurik was effectively running this massive, highly lucrative maritime shipping empire.
He was a major CEO in the medieval world.
Yeah. It's the equivalent of someone claiming they just founded a scrappy local startup in Silicon Valley. But historical records show they actually spent the previous 2 decades operating a multi-billion-dollar global logistics firm out of Amsterdam.
That is honestly a perfect analogy. It captures the sheer scale of his real-world influence. Because Rurik was deeply embedded in the Carolingian Empire.
He was dealing with the big guys.
Oh, yeah. He was interacting directly with figures like Lothair I and Charles the Bald.
The grandsons of Charlemagne.
Right, the guys who were actively carving up Western Europe. Rurik was a very strategic piece on their chessboard. And get this, he'd even been baptized into Western Christianity.
Wait, really? When was that?
In the year 826,
Yeah.
in the German city of Ingelheim. So he was the known, documented Western European royal with decades of geopolitical baggage.
Okay, so if his resume is that deeply tied to Denmark, Germany, and France, how does he end up becoming the mythical founder of an Eastern empire centered on Muscovy?
Well, that transformation required a massive leap of historical engineering. And that engineering actually took place much later, in the 18th century.
Oh, so we're fast-forwarding quite a bit.
Yeah, well, when the Russian Empire was trying to solidify itself as a major European power, under rulers like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, they needed an origin story that legitimized them.
They needed prestige.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they brought in German scholars, historians like Gerhard Friedrich Müller, who formulated what's called the Norman theory.
Okay. And what did that theory do to Rurik?
They basically retrofitted his history. They stripped away the Frankish politics, they ignored the Western baptism, and they created this neat imperial narrative of Eastern statehood.
So they essentially scrubbed his European geopolitical resume to make him fit the mold of a localized Eastern patriarch.
Yeah, they whitewashed the Frankish vassal part entirely.
Wow. But, I mean, if we restore that resume based on the sources, it flips the script entirely. The actual historical lineage through Rurik tethers the foundations of that early state directly back to Denmark, the Frankish courts, and Western Europe, not to the east.
Precisely. And that brings up the second massive contradiction in the traditional narrative.
Which is?
Well, if Rurik of Dorestad is this powerful Western European prince running a maritime empire, what exactly is he taking over when he finally travels east? The official story frames it as him bringing order to a chaotic, totally undeveloped land.
Oh, right. But the archaeological and historical record is glaringly clear that Kyiv was already a thriving metropolis long before Rurik ever set foot in the region.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, the chronicles detail its founding by the legendary siblings, Ki, Shek, Koriv, and their sister Libid. And archaeologists have found physical evidence of settlements in Kyiv centuries before 862.
Centuries before. And beyond just the city itself, we have to look at the word Rus.
Right, because that word gets thrown around a lot in these historical claims.
It does. But in its original narrative sense, Rus did not mean some sprawling transcontinental empire stretching all the way to the Urals. It referred to a very specific territory in modern Ukraine.
The lands of the Polyanians, the Drevlians, and the Severians, right?
Exactly. Geographically, we are talking about the triangle formed by Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Pereyaslav.
And there is actual non-Slavic documentation proving this state existed well before our Viking CEO arrived.
Oh, yes, the Frankish records?
Yeah, the Annals of St. Bertin. They were these meticulous records kept by Frankish monks, and they explicitly mention a Rus Khaganate in the year 839.
Which is 23 years before Rurik supposedly arrived to fix everything.
Exactly. And you also have 9th century Arabic geographers describing an established, wealthy group of Rus people operating a massive trade network near the Black Sea.
So the infrastructure was already there.
But wait, hold on, that doesn't add up to me. If Kyiv is already this rich, thriving merchant state and they are successfully navigating trade routes and paying off the Khazars to the east, why hand the keys over to a foreign mercenary?
It does seem counterintuitive, right?
Yeah. Usually wealthy cities just build thicker walls. They don't invite a foreign warlord with a massive army to just come in and take over.
Well, you have to look at the intense geopolitical pressure of that specific moment. Yes, Kyiv was affluent, but they were essentially a highly vulnerable merchant enterprise wedged between rival tribes and the Khazar Khaganate.
And the Khazars were serious business.
Very serious.
Yeah.
They were a massive, powerful nomadic empire that controlled the eastern trade routes. So Kyiv needed serious military protection. And Rurik wasn't just a guy with a sword. He was bringing elite royal lineage. He belonged to the Skjoldung dynasty.
Which is basically the absolute top-tier royalty of the Viking Age, so it's like hiring a mercenary commander who just happens to have a Rockefeller last name.
Exactly. It was an acquisition, or really a strategic merger. The local Kyivan elite brought Rurik in as a military CEO.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Yeah, they needed his veteran army to protect and expand their borders against the Khazars. And Rurik, well, he needed a new, wealthy kingdom that wasn't constantly being contested by the Frankish emperors he'd been fighting for decades.
Win-win.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He didn't build the state from scratch. He provided the military muscle to secure a state that was already functioning.
And because he brings that Western European retinue with him, we stumble into one of the most fascinating pieces of evidence in this entire debate. It completely rewrites the accepted timeline of religion in Eastern Europe.
Oh, the linguistic evidence. This is where it gets really interesting.
It is, because the traditional top-down story is that the region was officially baptized into Christianity in 988 by Vladimir the Great, who chose the Eastern Orthodox faith from Byzantium, from the Greeks.
Right. And that 998 date is foundational to the concept of a unified, Eastern-facing religious identity. But historians have uncovered a linguistic fossil record that tells a totally different story.
I love that phrase, linguistic fossil record.
It's so accurate, though, because language holds on to history even when documents are destroyed or rewritten. Think about it. If the foundational Christianity of Kyiv came strictly from the Greeks in 988, the core vocabulary of the church should be rooted in Greek.
But they aren't. And the specific words are mind-blowing because they completely betray the official timeline. Let's look at the Ukrainian word for church, which is cerkva.
Right.
If it came from Byzantium, it would stem from the Greek ekklesia. But it actually comes from the Old High German word Kirche, which is the exact same root as the English word church.
And it doesn't stop there. The word for cross, Christ, does not come from the Greek stavros. It derives from Old High German Christ, or the Latin Christus.
Wow.
And the word for priest, pip, that traces back to Old High German fafo, rather than the Greek kyrios. And the word for altar, vivtar, originates from the Latin altera.
It's literally like digging in a geological layer that's supposedly 1,000,000 years old and finding a modern wristwatch.
That is exactly what it is.
The words just shouldn't be there if the official story is true. So what does it actually mean that all these everyday religious words have Latin and Germanic roots?
It means that the reality on the ground was drastically different from the decree of a single ruler. This vocabulary proves there was a continuous, grassroots, Latin Germanic Christian influence permeating everyday life in Kyiv long before 988.
Because Rurik's people brought it with them.
Exactly. Rurik's retinue came from a deeply Western Christian context. They traded, married, and worshipped in Kyiv for generations. You don't adopt the German word for church unless you are regularly interacting with German-speaking Christians who are building and operating churches in your city.
And there is actually a physical document to back up this linguistic fossil record.
The 944 Treaty.
Yes. A treaty signed with Byzantium in the year 944, which is more than 4 decades before the official conversion. It explicitly mentions the Christian Church of St. Elijah operating in the Podil neighborhood of Kyiv.
That's undeniable proof.
It even notes that many of the Varangians, the Norseman elite, were already baptized Christians.
Which totally shatters the myth of a blank pagan slate waiting for enlightenment from the East. The cultural and religious gravity of early Kiev was heavily intertwined with Western Europe.
Okay, so if Rurik's real legacy is this deeply Western, Latin-speaking influence in Kyiv, it makes absolutely zero sense that the modern state narrative claims he started his rule in the frozen north of Novgorod. How do they square that circle geographically?
Well, they don't. They really can't. And this is where modern archaeology delivers the fatal blow to the 862 origin story.
Yes, the tree rings.
Yeah, to claim an unbroken lineage from Novgorod down to Kiev and eventually to Moscow, Novgorod obviously has to exist when Rurik arrives. But extensive excavations led by Valentin Yanin, who was one of the most prominent Soviet and Russian archaeologists, proved that it simply didn't exist yet.
Right, so this is where we get into Dendrochronology, which is tree ring dating. Can you explain exactly how they used tree rings to disprove a national myth?
Yeah, so in medieval Novgorod, the ground was incredibly muddy. To keep the streets navigable, the citizens paved them with pine logs.
Like wooden roads.
Exactly. And as those logs sank into the mud and rotted over the years, the next generation would just lay a fresh layer of logs right on top. Over centuries, this created a massive, stacked layer cake of preserved wood.
That's amazing.
It is. Archaeologists dug down through roughly 28 layers of these wooden streets. And because tree rings correspond perfectly to historical weather patterns, you can date a piece of wood almost to the exact year the tree was chopped down.
The rings don't lie.
They do not. And when Yanin's team dated the absolute lowest, oldest layer of wooden pavement in Novgorod, the logs were cut in the 930s or 950s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The city of Novgorod on the Volkhov River did not even exist in 862. It was built nearly a century after Rurik supposedly arrived there to rule it.
Okay, so if the tree rings definitively prove the northern city of Novgorod was just empty forest in 862, where did Rurik actually go when he came east?
Well, the historical evidence heavily points to Novgorod-Seversky. It's a totally different city located much further south in modern Ukraine.
Ah, confusing names.
Right. But it was the ancestral center of the Severian tribe. Archaeological layers there date back much further, perfectly aligning with the time frame of Rurik's arrival and the pre-existing Kievan trade networks.
So the entire geographic starting line is false. If the northern Novgorod wasn't the birthplace of the state, where did Muscovy, the predecessor to modern Russia, actually come from?
The historical trajectory of Muscovy is entirely separate from the early Kyivan Rus. It emerged from the Suzdal region, which was a distant northeastern area.
Right.
But more importantly, this region fell under the complete dominance and vassalage of the Golden Horde for centuries. The political culture that developed there was heavily influenced by the autocratic, centralized tribute system of the Mongol Empire.
Which was a stark contrast to the political systems developing in the West.
Very much so.
So how did that emerging autocratic Muscovy interact with the real Novgorod? Because eventually that northern Novgorod did get built, and it grew into a massively wealthy independent republic with a distinctly European flavor.
Yeah, it grew into the Novgorod Republic, and they were famously democratic for their time. They had a Vesh, which is a citizens' assembly. They elected their officials, restricted the power of their princes, and they were a major trading partner with the Hanseatic League in Western Europe.
So they were very European.
Very. But Muscovy did not view them as a sister city. They viewed them as a threat to be eradicated.
The history of how Moscow absorbed Novgorod is chilling. In 1478, the Grand Prince of Moscow, Ivan III, invaded and annexed the republic.
Yeah, he crushed them.
He systematically dismantled their democratic institutions.
Mhm.
He physically tore down the great bell that they used to call the Citizens' Assembly, and he deported their political elites.
But the complete erasure, that came a century later. In 1570, Ivan the Terrible unleashed a horrific 5-week massacre on the citizens of Novgorod. This wasn't just a military conquest. It was a targeted genocide designed to permanently lobotomize a competing political culture.
Thousands of citizens were tortured. Families were tied to sleds and dragged into the freezing Volkhov River to drown. The surrounding farmlands and estates were totally decimated. Why go to that extreme level of violence against people who are supposedly your own historical brethren?
Because they represented a dangerous alternative.
Mm.
The Novgorod Republic proved that a Slavic state could be highly successful, deeply integrated with Europe, and governed by a democratic assembly rather than an absolute autocrat.
They couldn't allow that example to survive.
Exactly. Ivan the Terrible had to completely annihilate that alternative reality so that Muscovy's autocratic model remained the only conceivable way to rule.
It is the geopolitical equivalent of murdering someone, burning their house down, putting on their clothes, and then legally changing your name to theirs so you can claim their inheritance.
That is a dark analogy, but it's spot on.
Muscovy violently destroyed the European-leaning Democratic Slavic Republic and then retroactively stole its history to legitimize its own empire.
And when you lay out the mechanics of what actually happened, the narrative used to justify modern conflicts fractures completely. Muscovy wasn't the continuation of Kyivan Rus.
Yeah.
It was a separate entity that emerged under the shadow of the Golden Horde, actively destroyed the true successors of that European-leaning heritage, and then weaponized a fabricated timeline to claim dominance over the very people it conquered.
So, bringing all these threads together for you listening, we started with Rurik of Dorestad, a Frisian prince running a maritime empire who brings his Western European military machine to a Kievan merchant state that was already centuries old.
Right. And we examined the linguistic fossils buried in the language. Words for church and cross that carry the DNA of Old High German and Latin, proving that Western Christianity was thriving in Kiev long before the official conversion narrative.
And we dug under the muddy streets of Novgorod to find that the tree rings completely invalidate the 862 origin myth, exposing how Muscovy violently erased a democratic Slavic neighbor before stealing its identity.
The overarching takeaway here is really about the mechanics of historical propaganda. The history presented on the world stage, especially when it is wheeled out to justify invasions and shifting borders, is often a meticulously curated fiction.
It's manufactured.
Completely. By looking at the hard evidence, like the physical wood, the root of a word, the contemporary Frankish documents, you can actually dismantle centuries of geopolitical engineering.
Which brings us right back to that 1,000-year-old title deed we mentioned at the start.
Yep.
We'll leave you with this provocative thought to mull over. If the foundational identity of a massive global power can be fundamentally unraveled just by counting tree rings under a medieval street and tracing the etymology of everyday words spoken in Kyiv, what other ancient, unquestioned origin stories of modern nations around the world might completely collapse if we just looked closely at the evidence hiding in plain sight?